Something had collided with his fence in the dead of night during the worst storm in decades. What Mason discovered in those terrifying moments would change not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windows like angry fists as Mason Cooper sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. His small Nebraska farm had weathered many storms, but tonight's was particularly vicious. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the old farmhouse to its foundation. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the collection of framed photos he kept face down these days, reminders of a life that no longer existed. Mason winced as he shifted in his chair, his right leg stiffening from the damp weather. It had been 3 years since the tractor accident, 3 years since he'd lost his wife Sarah to cancer, and then, just months later, nearly lost his own life when the equipment malfunctioned. The physical therapy had ended long ago, but the limp remained, along with the scars both visible and hidden. These days, he preferred the company of his 2 border collies to people. The locals in nearby Riverbrook had mostly given up trying to draw him back into community life. "Easy night, huh, Rusty?" Mason murmured to the older dog curled at his feet, the dog's ears perked up, head tilting in response. That's when it happened. A violent crash shattered the night's rhythm. Something heavy had struck his fence with enough force to be heard over the howling wind. Both dogs leapt to their feet, barking frantically. "Quiet down," Mason commanded, already rising from his chair. His instincts as a former volunteer firefighter kicked in before his mind could process what he'd heard. "Stay," he ordered the dogs, grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight and rain slicker from beside the door. His bad leg protested each step as he made his way to the mudroom. The moment he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him flat, rain lashing his face like tiny needles. He pulled his hood tighter and forged ahead, aiming his beam toward the eastern fence line, where the sound had originated. The flashlight's glow seemed pitifully inadequate against the storm's fury, bouncing wildly as he struggled through ankle-deep mud toward the pasture. Something moved in the darkness, a large, misshapen form slumped against the barbed wire fence that marked his property line. At first, Mason thought perhaps a deer had been driven mad by the storm and crashed into his fence. But as he drew closer, the beam finally stabilized on the shape, and his breath caught in his throat. A horse lay collapsed against the fence, its emaciated body heaving with labored breaths. What should have been a muscular frame was now a skeleton barely covered by skin, ribs protruding like the bars of a macabre cage. Its coat, Mason guessed it might once have been a rich palomino, was matted with mud, manure, and dark patches. That could only be blood. One back leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, swollen to nearly twice the size it should be. "Jesus Christ," Mason whispered, kneeling despite the mud immediately soaking through his jeans. He'd grown up around horses on his grandfather's ranch, had owned several himself before the accident changed everything. But he'd never seen an animal in such a state of devastation. The horse's eye rolled toward him, not with fear, but with something that cut Mason to his core, resignation, complete surrender. As if it had accepted that this fence line on a stranger's property would be its final resting place. The vacant look in that eye struck Mason harder than any physical blow. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As he extended his hand palm down, "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." The horse didn't flinch or rear. It had no strength left for fear. Its sides heaved with each labored breath, a wheeze accompanying every exhale. Upon closer inspection, Mason could see the animal's condition was even worse than he first thought. Deep lacerations scored its flanks and shoulders, some fresh, others partially healed into ugly scars. Its hooves were overgrown and splitting, and there were raw sores where a too-tight halter had once rubbed the flesh raw around its face. This wasn't just neglect. It was systematic abuse etched into flesh and bone. With gentle fingers, Mason examined what he could in the storm's fury. The twisted leg wasn't a fresh break. This was an old injury, months old at least, never properly treated and now grotesquely healed. Whoever had owned this animal had either deliberately tortured it or had been criminally negligent. "Who did this to you?" Mason murmured, running his hand carefully along the horse's neck. The animal trembled under his touch, but made no attempt to pull away. Whether from trust or simple exhaustion, Mason couldn't tell. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief flash of illumination, Mason saw the horse's eyes clearly, hollow pools that reflected a spirit as broken as its body. Something in that gaze reached past all the walls Mason had built around himself since Sarah's death, since his accident, since he'd withdrawn from the world. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Purpose, responsibility, connection. He glanced back toward his barn, calculating the distance. It was at least 200 yards across muddy terrain. In the horse's condition, there was no way it could walk there, and Mason, with his bad leg, couldn't possibly carry or drag it alone. But leaving it here wasn't an option. The temperature was dropping, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. By morning, the animal would likely be dead. "I'm getting you out of this rain," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "This isn't where your story ends, not tonight." Mason stood, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, and limped back toward the house as quickly as the slick ground would allow. He needed tarps, blankets, his truck if he could get it through the mud, anything to shelter and move this broken creature. For the first time in 3 years, Mason felt the fog of his isolation lifting, replaced by a singular focus that propelled him forward despite the storm's rage. Neither of them might make it through the night, but by God, he was going to try. The farmhouse door banged open as Mason staggered back inside, dripping rainwater across the floor. The dog circled anxiously around his legs as he moved with newfound urgency. "Not now, boys," he muttered, limping to the storage closet where he kept emergency supplies. His mind raced through options, weighing possibilities against the howling storm outside and the dying animal at his fence line. Mason grabbed a large canvas tarp, several worn but clean blankets, and a first aid kit he'd kept from his firefighting days. He paused at the kitchen counter, filling a bucket with lukewarm water and grabbing a clean rag. What else? His eyes fell on the bottle of whiskey on the shelf, not for drinking, but for disinfecting. He shoved it into his coat pocket. The barn's sliding door protested as Mason forced it open against the wind. Inside, he quickly hitched his old farm truck, praying the sturdy F-250 could handle the muddy terrain. The engine sputtered twice before roaring to life. Mason's jaw set with determination as he shifted into four-wheel drive, then eased the vehicle out into the storm. Headlights cut through sheets of rain as he carefully navigated toward the fence. Line! The truck lurching and sliding in the mud. He couldn't risk getting stuck, not tonight, not with that horse depending on him. Mason parked as close as he dared, about 30 yards from where the animal lay. "Still with me?" he called out as he approached the horse again, supplies bundled under one arm. In answer, the animal's head shifted slightly, one eye tracking his movement. "Good! That's good!" Mason laid the tarp out beside the horse, anchoring one edge with rocks to keep the wind from claiming it. Next came the challenging part, moving the animal. With his bad leg, he couldn't possibly lift the horse, but he needed to get it onto the tarp to drag it to shelter. "This is going to hurt," he warned, kneeling beside the horse. "I'm sorry about that." Working methodically, Mason first untangled the animal from the barbed wire fence, wincing as he discovered new cuts where the metal had bitten into flesh. The horse flinched, but made no sound beyond labored breathing. With gentle persistence, Mason managed to roll the horse onto the tarp, a few inches at a time, pausing whenever the animal tensed from pain. By the time the horse was centered on the tarp, Mason was soaked to the bone, his hands numb from cold and his leg throbbing mercilessly. He didn't allow himself to dwell on the pain. Instead, he quickly wrapped the horse in blankets, leaving only its head exposed. "Now for the hard part," he said, gathering the tarp's edges to create a makeshift sled. His truck was too far to drag. The horse all the way there, and the muddy ground made the task nearly impossible. Mason's mind flashed to Sarah. She would have known exactly what to do. She always did. Lightning illuminated the field again, and Mason spotted an old wheelbarrow he'd left near the fence after mending it last week. "That'll work," he muttered, releasing the tarp momentarily to retrieve it. The wheelbarrow wasn't designed for a horse, even one as emaciated as this, but Mason had no other options. With straining muscles and gritted teeth, he managed to maneuver the horse's front half into the barrow, leaving its hindquarters on. "The tarp. Just a little cooperation," he grunted as he began to push the wheelbarrow while pulling the tarp behind. The wheels sank into mud, nearly tipping the entire contraption, but Mason leaned his full weight against it until it moved forward an inch, then another. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every few feet, Mason had to stop, catch his breath, and adjust. His grip. The rain had turned to sleet, stinging his face and hands. His bad leg threatened to buckle with each step, but he forced himself forward through sheer willpower. "Almost there," he told the horse as much as himself when they finally neared the truck. "Just a little more." Getting the horse into the truck bed presented another seemingly impossible challenge. Mason positioned the wheelbarrow at the tailgate. Then, with a strength born of desperation, he pushed and lifted until the horse's front end was over the edge. The animal, sensing Mason's intent, made a feeble attempt to help, its good legs scrabbling weakly against the metal. "That's it," Mason encouraged, his voice breaking with effort. "Work with me." One final heave, and the horse collapsed fully into the truck bed. Mason secured the tailgate with trembling hands, then leaned against it for a moment, chest heaving, the cold air burning his lungs. There was no time to rest. The temperature was still dropping, and the horse needed immediate attention. The drive back to the barn was a blur of concentration as Mason navigated the treacherous ground, the truck fishtailing despite the four-wheel drive. When they finally reached the barn doors, Mason felt a surge of relief, so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Inside the barn, Mason had already prepared a stall with fresh straw during his earlier trip for supplies. Getting the horse from the truck to the stall required the last reserves of his strength. By the time the animal was settled on the thick bed of straw, Mason was at his limit, physically and emotionally drained. But the night's work had only begun. Under the harsh barn lights, the horse's condition was even more shocking. What Mason had initially taken for a palomino coat was actually a dull buckskin, the golden color hidden beneath layers of filth and dried blood. Its ribs resembled a washboard, each one visible beneath taut skin. The swollen leg was worse than he'd thought, clearly broken months ago and left to heal improperly, the bone visibly misaligned. "You poor thing," Mason whispered, his throat tight. "What the hell happened to you?" He began with the basics, cleaning the wounds with the warm water he'd brought from the house. The horse flinched at first contact, but soon stilled, perhaps understanding Mason's intentions. Some cuts were superficial, but others were deep enough to need stitches, something Mason couldn't provide tonight. He dabbed whiskey on the worst wounds, murmuring apologies when the horse trembled from the sting. Next came a thorough check for other injuries, 3 ribs that felt broken beneath his careful fingers, an eye swollen half shut, and patches of skin rubbed raw from what must have been an ill-fitting saddle. "Someone worked you hard and cared for you little," Mason said, his voice hard with anger. He'd seen neglected animals before, but this level of abuse spoke of deliberate cruelty. The horse needed water and food, but Mason knew from experience that too much too quickly could be fatal for a starved animal. He filled a shallow bucket with clean water, adding a little molasses to encourage drinking, and placed it within easy reach of the horse's head. Small sips, he advised, supporting the animal's head as it weakly lapped at the sweetened water. That's it, nice and slow. By the time Mason had done all he could, the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky outside the barn windows. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a strange stillness. The horse's breathing had steadied somewhat, though a worrying rattle remained in its chest. Mason slumped against the stall door, exhaustion finally claiming him. He should call the vet. Dr. Reynolds would come even on a Sunday if Mason explained the urgency, but that would have to wait until a decent hour. For now, all he could do was monitor the horse and hope it survived until help arrived. "I'm going to call you Phoenix," Mason said suddenly, the name coming to him unbidden, "because you're going to rise from these ashes. You hear me?" The horse's ear twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, and Mason took it as acknowledgement. He checked his watch. 5:43 a.m. Reynolds wouldn't appreciate a call before 7, but Mason would make it anyway. This couldn't wait. As he pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the protest from his bad leg, Mason's gaze met Phoenix's. The absolute surrender he'd seen earlier had been replaced by something else. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps a flicker of will. The horse was still fighting, despite everything. "We're both too stubborn to give up, aren't we?" Mason said softly, patting the horse's neck. "Get some rest. I'll be back soon." Outside, the world was washed clean by the storm, the rising sun painting the soggy fields with golden light. Mason paused at the barn door, looking back at the stall where Phoenix lay, then toward his empty farmhouse. For 3 years, he'd existed in solitude, going through the motions of living without truly engaging. Now, with the sudden appearance of this broken creature, something had shifted. Mason pulled out his cell phone and dialed Dr. Reynolds' emergency number. It was time to rejoin the world of the living, even if it began with a dawn phone call to a grumpy veterinarian. The universe, it seemed, had other plans for Mason Cooper than the slow fade into obscurity he'd planned for himself. And it had delivered. Those plans in the form of a half-dead horse on the worst night of the year. "You should put it down, Mason. That's the humane thing to do." Dr. Eliza Reynolds stood in the barn doorway, her weathered face grim as she packed away her veterinary supplies. The morning sunlight streamed through the open door behind her, creating a halo effect around her silver-streaked hair. She'd arrived. Within an hour of Mason's call, her ancient pickup truck caked with mud from the drive. "I didn't drag that horse through a storm just to kill it," Mason replied, his voice low but firm. He stood protectively beside Phoenix, who lay still on the straw, exhausted from the examination. Eliza sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose. "I understand the sentiment, but you need to be realistic. That leg was broken months ago and healed all wrong. The infection in those wounds is severe. There's pneumonia setting in, and God knows what internal injuries I can't even see." She gestured toward the horse with a weathered hand. "This animal has suffered enough." Mason's jaw tightened. What would it take to save him? "Him?" Eliza raised an eyebrow. "It's a mare, Mason, and it would take a miracle, or at the very least more money than sense." Mason blinked, surprised. He'd been so focused on the horse's injuries that he hadn't even checked its gender. A mare. Somehow that made her even more of a fighter in his eyes. "I've got the money," he said, crossing his arms. "Sarah's life insurance is still sitting in the bank. Might as well use it for something that matters." Eliza's expression softened at the mention of Sarah. She'd been their family doctor before, specializing in veterinary medicine, had known them both for 20 years. It's not just money, Mason. It's round-the-clock care for weeks, maybe months. Medications every few hours. Physical therapy once that leg starts to heal properly. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment? The question hung in the air between them. 3 years ago, Mason would have answered without hesitation. Now, after so much loss and isolation, he hesitated. Was he capable of this? Of caring for something so thoroughly broken? Phoenix shifted slightly on the straw, her good eye finding Mason's face. There was something in that gaze, not just pain, but a question, as if she too were wondering if Mason was up to the challenge. "I am," Mason said finally, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." Eliza studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, I'll draw up a treatment plan." She pulled out a notepad from her jacket pocket. "First, we need antibiotics, strong ones. I'll leave you with an injectable course, but you'll need to drive into Lincoln for the rest." "The feed store doesn't carry what she needs." Mason nodded, committing each instruction to memory as Eliza continued. "That leg needs to be rebroken and set properly, but she's too weak for surgery right now. We need to get the infection under control first. For now, cold compresses 4 times daily." She scribbled on her pad. "I'm leaving you with pain medication. It's expensive stuff, so use it exactly as directed." By the time Eliza finished listing medications, feeding schedules, and treatment protocols, Mason's head was swimming. The task ahead seemed monumental, but he'd made his decision. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on her," Eliza said, tearing off the pages of notes and handing them to Mason. "Call me immediately if her breathing gets worse or if she stops drinking." As they walked toward Eliza's truck, she paused, turning to face Mason directly. "You know this isn't just about the horse, don't you?" Mason looked away, uncomfortable with her penetrating gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do," Eliza replied gently. "You've been hiding out here for 3 years, Mason, ever since Sarah died, and that tractor nearly took you too. The whole town's noticed. Hell, I've noticed." Mason's jaw clenched. "I'm not hiding. I'm living. My way." "Are you?" Eliza challenged. "Because from where I stand, you've been doing a fair imitation of a ghost." She gestured toward the barn. "That mare in there, she needs someone who's fully alive to bring her back from the edge. Are you that person, Mason?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Was he alive enough to save something else? He honestly didn't know. "I guess we'll find out," he said finally. After Eliza left, Mason returned to the stall, the list of instructions clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Phoenix hadn't moved, but her eyes followed him as he entered. "So you're a lady, huh?" he said, kneeling beside her. "Should have guessed. Only a female would be stubborn enough to survive what you've been through." The mare's ear flicked, which Mason chose to interpret as agreement. "Dr. Reynolds thinks I should put you down," he continued, carefully checking her water bucket. "Says you're too far gone. What do you think about that?" Phoenix shifted slightly, a soft nickering sound escaping her. Mason smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's what I thought too. To hell with too far gone." Word traveled quickly in rural communities, and by afternoon, Mason's phone was buzzing with text messages from neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months. "Heard you took in a rescue horse. Need any help?" read one from Bill Gunderson, whose property bordered Mason's to the east. "Eleanor says you've got a horse in bad shape. We've got some spare medications from when our mare had colic. Let us know if you need anything," came another from Tom Wilkins, who ran the hardware store in town. Mason stared at his phone, surprised by the offers. He'd grown so accustomed to his isolation that he'd forgotten how quickly news spread in Riverbrook, and how readily people stepped up when one of their own needed support, even one who'd pushed them all away. Not everyone was supportive, however. As Mason was returning from a trip to the feed store with supplies, he found Sheriff Mike Davidson leaning against his patrol car in the driveway. "Afternoon, Mason," Mike said, pushing his hat back. They'd been friends once, fishing buddies every weekend before the accident. Now they were practically strangers. "Mike," Mason acknowledged, pulling the truck to a stop. "What brings you out?" "Got a report about an abused horse," Mike replied, his expression carefully neutral. "Eliza mentioned you'd found one in pretty bad shape." Mason's defenses rose immediately. And I need to file a report. Animal abuse is a crime. If someone in the county is mistreating horses, I need to know about it." Mason hesitated. He hadn't even thought about the legal aspects of the situation or about finding whoever had done this to Phoenix. He'd been too focused on keeping her alive. "I don't know who owned her," Mason admitted. "She just crashed into my fence during the storm. No identification, no markings I recognize." Mike nodded slowly. "Mind if I take a look at her? Might be able to match her to any reports of missing horses." Together they walked to the barn, where Phoenix lay in the same position, though Mason noted with satisfaction that she'd drunk some water in his absence. Mike whistled low when he saw her condition. "Jesus, someone did a number on her." "Yeah," Mason agreed, anger rising in his chest again. "Whoever it was deserves to be locked up." Mike knelt beside the horse, carefully examining her. "No brands that I can see, no distinctive markings under all this." He gestured to the filth still covering much of her coat. "Could be stolen, could be abandoned, hard to tell." He stood, brushing straw from his uniform pants. "I'll put out some inquiries, but honestly, horse thefts usually get reported quick. If no one's claimed her by now, chances are nobody wants to admit she was theirs." "Because of her condition," Mason surmised. "Exactly," Mike confirmed. "Anyone who let a horse get to this state knows they'd face charges." He hesitated, then added, "Eliza says her chances aren't good." Mason stiffened. "She'll make it." Mike studied him, a flash of the old friendship crossing his features. "If anyone can save her, it'd be you. You always were a stubborn son of a bitch." Despite himself, Mason felt a small smile tug at his mouth. "Takes one to know one." As the sheriff turned to leave, he paused at the barn door. "The Jameson kid's been asking about you, you know. Tyler. Says he misses learning about the farm." Mason's throat tightened unexpectedly. Tyler Jameson was the son of his nearest neighbors, a bright 10-year-old who used to follow Mason around each summer, soaking up knowledge about crops and machinery. After the accident, Mason had cut off those visits along with everything else. "Tell him I've been busy," Mason said lamely. Mike shook his head. "Tell him yourself. Kid rides his bike past your place every day after school, probably hoping you'll wave him over." With that parting shot, he climbed into his patrol car and drove away. Mason stood in the barn doorway, watching the dust settle on the driveway. First Eliza, now Mike, both poking at wounds he'd thought had scarred over. He turned back to Phoenix, who watched him with that steady gaze that seemed to see right through him. "They think I'm the one who needs saving," he told her. "Can you believe that?" Phoenix nickered softly, and Mason could have sworn there was agreement in the sound. The next several days fell into an exhausting routine. Mason was up before dawn to administer Phoenix's first medications of the day, cleaning her wounds and applying fresh bandages. By mid-morning, he'd make the trip to Lincoln for specialized medications or supplies that Riverbrook's small stores couldn't provide. Afternoons were spent carefully feeding Phoenix small amounts of a special mash Eliza had recommended for undernourished horses, a mixture of beet pulp, alfalfa, and a high-calorie supplement that cost more per pound than prime steak. Mason would sit beside her for hours, hand-feeding her tiny portions to ensure she didn't eat too quickly. Evenings brought another round of medications, wound cleaning, and cold compresses for the badly healed leg. Mason would talk to her throughout. These sessions, his voice filling the barn with stories he hadn't thought about in years, tales of his grandfather's farm, where he'd spent summers as a boy, memories of his first horse, anecdotes about Sarah and the life they'd planned together. Phoenix, seemed to listen, her ears pricked forward whenever he spoke. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between treatments, Mason found himself confessing things he'd never told anyone. "I wasn't driving the tractor when it flipped," he told her one evening as he gently rubbed salve into a particularly nasty wound on her flank. "That's what I let everyone believe. The truth is, I was trying to fix the hydraulics while it was still running. Stupid mistake." Phoenix's ear twitched, and Mason continued, his voice low in the dimly lit barn. "Sarah had just died. I wasn't thinking straight. Didn't care much if I lived or died myself, to be honest. Funny thing is, when that tractor came down on me, pinned my leg, I suddenly wanted to live. Isn't that something? We never know how much we want to survive until we're staring death in the face." He glanced at Phoenix, whose eyes had drifted, closed, her breathing steadier than it had been since he'd found her. "I think you understand that too, don't you?" he whispered. 2 weeks into Phoenix's recovery, progress came in almost imperceptible increments. Each morning, Mason would enter the barn with his heart in his throat, half expecting to find that she hadn't made it through the night. But each morning she was there, still breathing, still fighting. The infections had begun to respond to the antibiotics, her wounds slowly closing with fresh pink tissue. The worrying rattle in her lungs had diminished, though her breathing remained labored. She drank more water now and had graduated to slightly larger portions of the special feed mixture. But she still couldn't stand. "She needs to get up," Eliza insisted during one of her regular visits. "Those muscles will atrophy if she's down much longer. The broken leg isn't going to heal properly without some controlled weight-bearing." Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I've tried, Eliza. She just doesn't have the strength." "Then we need to give her a little help," Eliza replied, glancing around the barn thoughtfully. "Got any 2x4s and some decent rope?" By that afternoon, Mason had constructed a makeshift sling system from the barn's ceiling beams, following Eliza's instructions. The contraption looked dubious at best, but Eliza assured him it would work. "We're not trying to lift her entirely," she explained. "Just enough to take some weight off her legs while she tries to stand. Horses aren't meant to lie down for weeks on end. Their own body weight can cause damage to internal organs and circulation problems." Getting Phoenix into the sling was an ordeal that left both Mason and Eliza sweating despite the cool spring air. The mare clearly understood what they were attempting and tried to cooperate, but her weakness made even the smallest movements difficult. She flinched and trembled as they adjusted straps under her belly and chest. "Easy, girl," Mason murmured, stroking her neck as Eliza prepared to operate the pulley system. "We're trying to help. I know it hurts." Phoenix's eyes, once dull with resignation, now watched him with a wary alertness. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a far cry from the empty surrender he'd seen that first night. "Ready?" Eliza asked, gripping the rope. "On 3. As the sling gradually tightened, taking Phoenix's weight, the mare's legs scrabbled weakly against the straw. Mason supported her on one side, while Eliza controlled the tension on the ropes. "Come on, Phoenix," Mason encouraged, his voice low and steady. "You can do this. Just a little at a time." For several agonizing minutes, it seemed the attempt would fail. Phoenix's legs trembled violently, unable to coordinate or support even the reduced weight. Mason's heart sank as he watched her struggle. Then something shifted. Phoenix gave a soft, nickering sound, almost like a grunt of determination, and her good rear leg found purchase. Her front legs followed, straightening shakily. "That's it!" Mason exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion. "There you go!" Phoenix stood for all of 10 seconds before her strength gave out. But those 10 seconds felt like victory. "We'll do this twice a day," Eliza instructed, carefully lowering the mare back down. 10 minutes in the morning, 10 in the evening. Gradually increase the time as she builds strength. Mason nodded, still buzzing from the small breakthrough. "We can do that." The sling sessions became the focal points of Mason's days. Each morning and evening, he would carefully help Phoenix into the contraption, talking to her continuously as they worked together to rebuild her wasted muscles. Some days brought progress, a few seconds longer on her feet, a steadier stance. Other days brought setbacks, trembling legs that wouldn't cooperate, or the mare's obvious pain causing her to resist the sling entirely. Through it all, Mason maintained a patience he hadn't known he possessed. Where once he might have given up in frustration, he now found himself adapting, trying new approaches, celebrating the smallest victories. "You stood for nearly 2 minutes today," he told Phoenix one evening, brushing her coat with long, gentle strokes. The act of grooming had become therapeutic for both of them. "That's 30 seconds longer than yesterday. We'll hit 5 minutes by next week, you'll see." As Phoenix's physical condition slowly improved, so did her appearance. Regular grooming had revealed the true color of her coat, not the dull buckskin Mason had initially thought, but a rich golden palomino with a flaxen mane and tail. The matted clumps had given way to a smoother coat that, while still dull from malnutrition, showed hints of the lustrous shine it might one day regain. One morning, as Mason arrived for their session, he found Phoenix attempting to rise on her own. She had managed to get her front legs under her and was struggling to lift her hindquarters when he entered the stall. "Whoa there," he said, rushing to her side. "You trying to do this without me?" The mare snorted, still straining to stand. Mason hesitated, torn between helping her and letting her try on her own. In the end, he compromised, providing minimal support as Phoenix continued her efforts. With a tremendous effort that left her sides heaving, the mare finally stood, wobbling precariously but upright. Mason held his breath, afraid to move lest he break the spell. Phoenix's bad leg barely touched the ground, but her other 3 legs trembled with the strain of supporting her weight. "Look at you," Mason whispered, his chest tight with pride. "Standing on your own." Phoenix managed to remain upright for nearly a minute before carefully lowering herself back to the straw. But something fundamental had changed. The mare had proven to herself and to Mason that recovery wasn't just a possibility, but a reality they were working toward together. That afternoon, as Mason was mixing Phoenix's feed, he heard the crunch of bicycle tires on gravel. Looking up, he saw a lanky boy with sandy hair pedaling tentatively up the driveway, slowing as he approached the barn. Tyler Jameson. Mason's first instinct was to duck back inside, to avoid the conversation he'd been dodging for 3 years. But something stopped him. Perhaps the memory of Mike's words, or perhaps the example Phoenix had set that morning, facing her struggle head-on despite the pain. "Afternoon, Tyler," Mason called, setting down the feed bucket. The boy nearly fell off his bike in surprise, clearly not expecting Mason to acknowledge him. He quickly steadied himself, a hesitant smile spreading across his freckled face. "Mr. Cooper," he said, his voice caught between the child Mason remembered and the teenager he was becoming. I heard you had a rescue horse." Mason nodded, suddenly aware of how strange this must seem to the boy, the man who had shut everyone, out now taking in a broken animal. "Word travels fast," he said. Tyler fidgeted with his bike's handlebars. "My dad says she's in pretty bad shape." She was, Mason agreed. "She's doing better now. Still has a long way to go, though." An awkward silence stretched between them. Mason could see the questions in Tyler's eyes, the confusion about why Mason had cut him off, why this horse was deserving of care when their friendship apparently hadn't been. "Would you like to see her?" Mason found himself asking, surprising himself as much as Tyler. The boy's face lit up. "Really? I mean, yeah, I'd like that." Mason led Tyler into the barn, explaining as they walked. "She's still very weak, and that leg is going to need surgery eventually. But she's a fighter." They stopped at Phoenix's stall. The mare had been dozing but lifted her head at their approach, her eyes immediately finding Mason, then shifting to assess the newcomer. "Her name's Phoenix," Mason said, "because she's rising from the ashes." Tyler nodded solemnly, taking in the mare's condition with the directness only children seem capable of. "What happened to her?" he asked. Mason shook his head. "I don't know. The whole story. Someone mistreated her badly. Then she ended up at my fence during that big storm a couple weeks back. Can I—" Tyler hesitated. "Can I touch her?" Slowly, Mason cautioned. "Let her see your hand first. She's still getting used to people being kind to her." With careful movements that impressed Mason, Tyler extended his hand palm down near Phoenix's muzzle, not pushing forward, but letting the mare decide whether to accept the contact. After a moment's consideration, Phoenix stretched her neck slightly, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the boy's hand. "She's checking you out," Mason explained. "Horses have an excellent sense of smell." Phoenix apparently approved of what she found. Because she allowed Tyler to gently stroke her muzzle, the boy's face was a study in wonder and sadness. "Who would hurt a horse like this?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "Someone who's hurting themselves, probably," Mason answered after a moment. "Hurt people hurt others. Doesn't make it right, but sometimes that's how it goes." Tyler nodded, still petting. "Phoenix, is that why you stopped letting me come over? Because you were hurting after Mrs. Cooper died and your accident?" The question, delivered with a child's straightforward innocence, hit Mason like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deflect, then closed it, looking at Phoenix. The mare's eyes seemed to challenge him to answer honestly. "Yeah," Mason admitted. "Finally. I guess that's exactly why. I wasn't in a good place, still working on that." Tyler seemed to accept this explanation without judgment. "My grandpa was like that after Grandma died. Dad said he needed space to figure things out." "Your dad's a smart man," Mason said. "Phoenix is helping you figure things out?" Tyler asked. Mason smiled faintly. "Something like that." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, Phoenix seeming to enjoy the attention from both of them. Finally, Tyler glanced at his watch. "I should get home before dinner," he said reluctantly. "Mom gets worried." Mason nodded. "Thanks for stopping by, for checking on Phoenix." As they walked back to Tyler's bike, the boy asked hesitantly, "Could I come by again sometime? Maybe help with Phoenix?" A month ago, Mason would have refused immediately. 3 years of isolation had become his comfort zone, his protection against further loss. But standing there, watching Tyler's hopeful expression, Mason felt something shift inside him, the same way something had shifted when he'd watched Phoenix stand on her own that morning. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Phoenix would too, I think." As Tyler pedaled away, waving over his shoulder, Mason turned back toward the barn. Small steps. That's what Phoenix was teaching him. Small, painful steps forward were still progress, even when the destination wasn't clear. That night, as Mason completed their evening sling session, he found himself talking to Phoenix about the visit. "You made quite an impression on Tyler," he told her, adjusting the support under her belly. "Kid's been waiting 3 years for me to wave him over, and you managed to get him in the barn on the first day." Phoenix snorted softly, her weight gradually shifting to her own legs as Mason reduced the sling support. I know. I've been an idiot, shutting everyone out. Sarah would have hated seeing me like this." The mare's ears pricked forward at the name, as if she recognized it from Mason's previous stories. "She loved horses," Mason continued, his voice softening with memory. "Had this chestnut Arabian when we first met. Most beautiful animal I'd ever seen, until she rode up on it." Phoenix shifted her weight, testing her bad leg gingerly. Each day she grew a little stronger, a little more determined. "You would have loved her, and she would have adored you," Mason said, carefully releasing the final strap. "She never could resist a challenge. 6 weeks after the storm that brought Phoenix into Mason's life, spring had fully arrived in Nebraska. The fields surrounding the farm had transformed from muddy expanses to lush green carpets dotted with wildflowers. The warmer weather seemed to breathe new life into everything it touched, including Phoenix. The mare's progress, while still slow, had become more noticeable with each passing day. She could now stand on her own for nearly 15 minutes at a time, though her damaged leg remained a serious concern. The swelling had decreased thanks to Eliza's treatment regimen, but the bone had set incorrectly, leaving Phoenix with a pronounced limp. "She needs that surgery, Mason," Eliza reminded him during her weekly visit. "I've got a colleague in Omaha who specializes in equine orthopedics. Dr. Winters is the best in the state. If anyone can fix that leg properly, it's him." Mason nodded, watching Phoenix carefully take a few steps across her stall. "How much?" $8,000 minimum," Eliza replied bluntly. "Possibly more, depending on what he finds once he gets in. There. The longer we wait, the more complicated it becomes." $8,000 was a significant sum, even with Sarah's life insurance money. But seeing Phoenix's determination as she fought to strengthen her damaged body, Mason couldn't imagine denying her the chance at full recovery. "Make the appointment," he said. "She deserves a fair shot." Eliza smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I already did, 2 weeks from Thursday. I had a feeling you'd say yes." Mason rolled his eyes but couldn't help returning her smile. "Always. One step ahead, aren't you?" "Someone's got to be," she retorted. "Now let's talk about transportation. She's not ready for a trailer ride that long. Too much stress on that leg, with the swaying and stopping." They were discussing options when the sound of a bicycle on gravel announced Tyler's arrival. The boy had become a regular presence at the farm, stopping by 3 times a week after school to help with Phoenix. Mason had been surprised at how quickly he'd adapted to having the kid around again, how naturally they'd fallen back into their old rhythm of conversation. "Mr. Cooper!" Tyler called out, leaning his bike against the barn wall and hurrying inside. "I brought something for Phoenix." He held up a bright red apple, polished to a shine, trying to buy her affection. Mason teased, nodding toward the treat. Tyler grinned. "Mom says the way to anyone's heart is through their stomach. Figured it works for horses, too." Eliza laughed. "Your mother is a wise woman, Tyler. Just make sure to cut that into small pieces. Phoenix is still on a careful diet." As they watched Tyler gently feed apple slices to Phoenix, Eliza murmured to Mason, "That boy's been good medicine for both of you." Mason couldn't disagree. Tyler's enthusiasm was infectious, his uncomplicated kindness a reminder of simpler times. The boy approached Phoenix's care with a dedication that belied his age, carefully following Mason's instructions and eagerly absorbing any knowledge offered. "Has she been outside yet?" Tyler asked, stroking Phoenix's neck as she lipped the last piece of apple from his palm. Mason shook his head. "Not ready for that much activity, maybe in another week or so." "Actually," Eliza interjected, "I think a little sunshine and grass might do her good. Not the open pasture, of course, but perhaps that small paddock by the barn, the one with the good fence. 20 minutes of fresh air won't hurt, as long as we're careful." Mason hesitated. The small paddock was visible from the main road that ran past his property. Taking Phoenix outside meant making her recovery a public affair, inviting the curiosity and commentary of anyone who drove by. It was one thing to let Tyler into his world, quite another to open that door wider. But looking at Phoenix's bright eyes as Tyler described the beautiful day outside, Mason realized he was being selfish. The mare had spent weeks confined to the barn, fighting for every step of progress. She deserved to feel the spring sunshine on her back. "All right," he conceded, "but we take it slow, and we stay with her the entire time." Tyler's face lit up with excitement. "Can I help walk her out?" "We all will," Eliza said firmly. This is a three-person job at minimum. Getting Phoenix from the stall to the paddock was an exercise in patience and caution. Mason took the lead, holding a rope attached to her halter, while Eliza positioned herself on the mare's right side to help steady her if needed. Tyler walked behind, under strict instructions to keep a safe distance in case Phoenix startled or lost her balance. "Easy does it," Mason murmured as they stepped from the dim barn into the sun-drenched yard. "One step at a time." Phoenix froze momentarily at the threshold, blinking in the sudden brightness. Her nostrils flared as she drank in the fresh spring air, ears swiveling to capture the sounds of birds and distant farm equipment. "She's remembering," Eliza observed quietly. "This might be the first time she's been outside in a positive context in a very long time." After a moment's hesitation, Phoenix took a tentative step forward, then another. Her movement was awkward, her bad leg barely touching the ground, but her determination was evident in every careful step. The small paddock was only about 30 yards from the barn, but it took nearly 15 minutes to reach it. By the time Mason opened the gate, sweat gleamed on Phoenix's neck from the exertion, and her breathing had quickened. "Should we take her back?" Tyler asked worriedly. "She seems tired." "Let's give her a minute," Mason suggested. "See what she wants to do." Once inside the paddock, Phoenix stood very still, as if processing her new surroundings. The enclosure wasn't large, perhaps 40 feet square, with fresh spring grass covering most of its area. A single maple tree provided dappled shade in one corner. Slowly, almost reverently, Phoenix lowered her head and sniffed the grass. Then, with a soft nickering sound that Mason had come to recognize as pleasure, she took a small bite. "Look at that," Eliza said, smiling. "First fresh grass in probably months." Tyler clapped his hands softly. "She likes it." "Don't get too excited," Mason cautioned. "We need to limit how much she eats. Too much rich spring grass could make her sick after all the dry feed." But his warning couldn't dampen the mood. There was something profoundly right about seeing Phoenix in the sunshine, her golden coat gleaming as she carefully grazed. For the first time since her arrival, Mason could imagine what she might have looked like before the abuse. Proud, strong, beautiful. They stayed with her for exactly 20 minutes, as Eliza had prescribed. Phoenix spent most of that time grazing in small circles, occasionally lifting her head to gaze at the distant fields, as if remembering a freedom long lost. When it was time to return to the barn, Mason expected resistance, but Phoenix followed willingly, seeming to understand her limitations. "We'll do this again tomorrow," he promised her as they settled her back in the stall. A little longer each day. The daily excursions to the paddock quickly became the highlight of Phoenix's routine. Each day she grew stronger, ventured a little farther across the enclosure, stayed out a little longer. Mason installed an old patio chair so he could sit and watch her, often joined by Tyler when the boy wasn't in school. It was during one of these sessions, nearly 8 weeks after the rescue, that the milestone moment occurred. Mason was sitting in the chair while Tyler practiced braiding Phoenix's growing mane, a skill he'd been determined to master. Phoenix stood patiently under the maple tree, occasionally shifting her weight, but otherwise content to be groomed. "Mr. Cooper," Tyler said suddenly, his voice hushed with excitement. "Look!" Mason glanced up from the notebook where he'd been tracking Phoenix's medications and feed. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Phoenix had shifted her stance and was now resting weight on her damaged leg. Not much, just enough to be noticeable, but it was the first time she'd willingly put pressure on that leg without obvious pain. "Don't make any sudden movements," Mason whispered, slowly rising from his chair. "Let's see what she does." As they watched in silent amazement, Phoenix took a tentative step forward, then another, moving with more fluidity than they had yet seen. Her gait was still uneven, the damaged leg clearly weaker than the others. but the improvement was unmistakable. "She's walking better!" Tyler exclaimed, forgetting to keep his voice down in his excitement. Phoenix's ears swiveled toward the boy, but she didn't spook. Instead, she continued her careful progress around the tree, completing a full circle before returning to where Tyler stood. "I think she's showing off for you," Mason said, a rare smile spreading across his face. "She knows you're impressed." Tyler reached up to stroke Phoenix's neck, his expression solemn despite his excitement. "She's the bravest horse ever." "That she is," Mason agreed. That evening, after Tyler had gone home and Phoenix was settled in her stall, Mason called Eliza with the news. "She's using the leg," he reported, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Actually putting weight on it and walking almost normally." "That's fantastic," Eliza replied. "It means the pain management is working, and she's building confidence. How's her appetite?" "Better than ever. Finished all her feed today and looked for more." "Another good sign," Eliza confirmed. "And her wound healing?" Mason glanced over at Phoenix, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand every word. "Almost complete," he said. "Just that one spot on her flank that's still scabbed over. Everything else is closed up nicely." "Sounds like our girl is ready for her surgery next week," Eliza concluded. "Dr. Winters will be impressed with how far she's come." After hanging up, Mason settled onto the stool beside Phoenix's stall, an evening ritual that had become as natural as breathing. The mare nickered softly in greeting, shuffling closer to the bars that separated them. "You showed us something special today," Mason told her, reaching through to stroke her forehead. "Eliza thinks you're ready for that surgery." "I think she's right." Phoenix pressed her head against his hand, seeking more contact. The gesture still amazed Mason. This animal so horribly mistreated by humans, now actively seeking human touch. It spoke of a capacity for trust that transcended past trauma. "You know," Mason continued, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, "when I found you that night I thought I was saving you. Turns out it might be the other way around." Phoenix blinked slowly, her expression serene, as Mason continued to stroke her face. "Tyler asked me today if you could stay here permanently," he said. "Even after you're healed up. Kid's got his heart. Set on teaching you to carry a rider again someday." He paused, considering the idea. "What do you think? Is this home now?" Phoenix extended her neck, pressing her muzzle against Mason's chest in what felt remarkably like an answer. For the first time in 3 years, Mason allowed himself to think beyond the immediate future, to imagine a life rebuilt around this unexpected connection. Phoenix had come to him broken and had found healing. Perhaps the same could be true for him. That night, as twilight settled over the farm, Mason did something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He called Mike Davidson and invited him over for coffee the next morning. It was time to reconnect with more than just a horse and a 10-year-old boy. As he hung up the phone, Mason looked out toward the barn, where Phoenix rested. Sometimes the first step was the hardest, but once taken, each one that followed became a little easier. Phoenix had taught him that. "You've turned into a horse person again," Mike Davidson said, leaning against the paddock fence with a steaming mug of coffee. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dewy grass as Phoenix grazed peacefully nearby. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mason shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Neither did I." 3 months had passed since that stormy night when Phoenix had crashed into Mason's fence. The transformation in both horse and man was remarkable, and increasingly noticed by the residents of Riverbrook. Phoenix had returned from her surgery. In Omaha 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Winters had performed what he called a minor miracle on her damaged leg, removing the improperly healed bone, inserting metal pins, and reconstructing ligaments that had been torn and neglected. The recovery would be long, but the prognosis was better than anyone had dared hope. She might always have a slight limp, the surgeon had told Mason, but with proper rehabilitation, she should be able to carry a rider eventually. Light work only, nothing too strenuous, but far better quality of life than I initially expected. Now, watching Phoenix move across the paddock with a grace that was gradually returning to her once broken body, Mason found it difficult to reconcile this animal with the dying creature he'd found in the storm. Her golden coat gleamed in the sunlight, the result of proper nutrition and daily grooming. Her mane and tail, once matted beyond recognition, now flowed like spun gold when she trotted. Most striking was the change in her eyes, alert, engaged, curious about the world around her. "Sheriff Collins over in Lancaster County thinks he might have a lead on who owned her," Mike said, interrupting Mason's thoughts. "Guy named Harlan Reeves runs a small-time rodeo operation, but there have been complaints about his treatment of animals for years. Nothing that's stuck until now." Mason's jaw tightened. "He did this to her." Mike nodded grimly. "Looks that way. Collins found a bill of sale matching Phoenix's description. They're checking dental records to confirm. Apparently Reeves buys up former show horses when they're past their prime, uses them for rodeo practice until they break down." The thought of Phoenix being subjected to such treatment made Mason's blood boil. "Will he face charges? If we can prove it was him, absolutely. Animal cruelty, neglect, abandonment. Collins wants you to testify about her condition when you found her." Mason watched Phoenix lift her head, ears perked toward a hawk circling. Overhead. Whatever it takes, nobody should get away with what was done to her. Mike studied his old friend over the rim of his coffee mug. "You know, when Sarah died, we were all worried about you. Then after the accident, when you shut everyone out, some folks thought we'd lost you for good." Mason kept his eyes on Phoenix, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but no longer able to simply walk away from it. "I wasn't in a good place," he admitted finally. "No kidding," Mike snorted. "But look at you now, hosting a barbecue next weekend?" "Eleanor nearly fell off her chair when she got your invitation." Mason chuckled despite himself. "Tyler's idea, not mine. Kid thinks Phoenix needs a proper welcome home party after her surgery." "And you agreed?" Mike's eyebrows rose in exaggerated shock. Seemed important to him. Mason shrugged, then added more honestly, "And maybe it's time. The idea of hosting a gathering would have been unthinkable months ago. But Tyler's enthusiasm had been impossible to resist, especially when the boy pointed out that everyone in town had contributed in some way to Phoenix's recovery, from Tom at the hardware store donating materials for the paddock extension, to Eleanor organizing a fundraiser at the diner to help with the surgery costs, to Bill Gunderson bringing over fresh hay when Mason was too busy with Phoenix's care to cut his own fields. The whole town helped save her, Mr. Cooper. Tyler had insisted they should get to see how good she's doing now. So invitations had been sent and plans made for a Saturday afternoon gathering centered around the mayor, who had unexpectedly brought a community back together with a man they'd almost given up on. "People have missed you, you know," Mike said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Not just Tyler." Mason nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "I miss them too. Just didn't know how to say it." Mike clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of friendship that would have felt intrusive months ago, but now felt like coming home. "Well, you're saying it now. That's what matters." As the day of the barbecue approached, Mason found himself surprisingly caught up in the preparations. He mowed the lawn that had been neglected for seasons, power-washed the porch, and even dug out the string lights Sarah had loved for summer gatherings, stringing them between the oak trees near the paddock. Tyler arrived early that Saturday, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mum's bringing her famous potato salad," he announced, helping Mason set up folding tables. "And Mr. Wilson from the feed store is bringing his smoker for the brisket." Sounds like you've organized more than a simple barbecue, Mason observed, amused by the boy's enthusiasm. Tyler grinned. Phoenix deserves a real party. Oh, I almost forgot. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a package wrapped in tissue paper. I made something for her. Inside was a braided halter made of soft blue and gold rope, clearly crafted with painstaking care. It's her show halter, Tyler explained proudly, for when she's all better and can go to horse shows. Mason examined the halter, touched by the hours of work it represented and the absolute faith in Phoenix's eventual full recovery it demonstrated. It's perfect, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. She'll love it. Together, they groomed Phoenix, until her coat gleamed, then carefully fitted her with the new halter. The mare stood patiently throughout the process, occasionally nuzzling Tyler's pockets for the treats she knew he always carried. She looks beautiful, Tyler declared, stepping back to admire their work. Like a real champion. As the first guests began to arrive, Mason felt a familiar anxiety creeping back, the instinct to retreat, to protect himself from the messiness of human connection. But watching Phoenix greet each visitor with curious interest, despite all the reasons she had to fear humans, gave him the courage to stay present. Eliza arrived with her husband, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from their garden. Our girl looks magnificent, she said, gesturing toward Phoenix in the paddock. You've done incredible work with her, Mason. We all did, he corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. The gathering grew as more townspeople arrived, many bringing dishes to share and stories to tell. Some, like Eleanor from the diner, hadn't seen Phoenix since her early days of recovery and gasped at the transformation. She's a different animal entirely, Eleanor marveled, watching Phoenix trot along the fence line, her movements growing more fluid with each passing day. If I hadn't seen her before, I'd never believe she was the same horse. Mason found himself surrounded by neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, accepting handshakes and claps on the back, fielding questions about Phoenix's progress, and, occasionally, about himself. To his surprise, the interactions didn't drain him as he'd feared. Instead, there was a comfort in reconnecting, in being part of something beyond his own isolated existence again. The highlight of the afternoon came when Dr. Winters, the surgeon who had operated on Phoenix, arrived unexpectedly. I was in the area for another consultation, he explained, shaking Mason's hand. Thought I'd stop by and check on my star patient. The distinguished veterinarian spent nearly an hour examining Phoenix, evaluating her gait and the healing of her surgical wounds. His assessment, delivered to the crowd that had gathered around the paddock, was met with spontaneous applause. In 30 years of equine orthopedics, I've rarely seen such a remarkable recovery, he announced. The physical healing is impressive enough, but the psychological resilience this mare has shown is truly extraordinary. Horses that have suffered the kind of abuse Phoenix endured often never fully trust humans again. Yet here she is, accepting touch, following commands, even seeking interaction. Dr. Winters turned to Mason. Whatever you've been doing, it's working. She's not just surviving, she's thriving. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the gathering took on a festive atmosphere. Someone brought out a guitar, and impromptu music filled the air. Children took turns offering carrots to Phoenix under Tyler's careful supervision. Mason found himself in conversations that would have been impossible months ago, sharing stories of Phoenix's recovery and gradually memories of his life before isolation took hold. Sarah would have loved this, Eleanor said quietly, joining Mason where he stood watching the activity around the paddock. Seeing you with that horse, with all these people, she always said you had a gift for healing things. Mason swallowed hard. I wasn't able to heal her. Eleanor's weathered hand found his arm, squeezing gently. No, dear. Some things are beyond our power to fix, but that doesn't mean we stop trying with the things we can. As darkness fell, the string lights twinkled to life, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Mason stood slightly apart, watching as Tyler led a small group of children in singing "Happy Birthday" to Phoenix. The boy had decided that the day of her rescue would serve as her new birthday, a celebration of her second chance at life. Mike appeared at Mason's side, handing him a fresh glass of lemonade. Quite a day. Mason nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the lump in his throat. You know what I see when I look at that horse? Mike continued, nodding toward Phoenix. I see you. Mason gave him a questioning look. Both of you were broken, Mike explained. Both shut down, given up. And now look, both finding your way back. Different, sure. Changed by what happened, but whole in a new way. As the party began to wind down, guests drifted toward their cars with promises to return soon. Tyler reluctantly prepared to leave with his parents, but not before extracting a promise from Mason that he could return the next day to continue their work with Phoenix. In the quiet that followed, Mason found himself alone with Phoenix in the paddock. The string, lights casting soft shadows across the grass. The mare stood beside him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder in a gesture of companionship that still amazed him. They're right, you know, he told her softly. You're not the same horse I found that night. You're stronger, braver. Phoenix nickered softly as if in agreement. Maybe I'm not the same person either, Mason continued, reaching up to stroke her neck. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. The transformation was visible in both of them. Phoenix's healed body and renewed spirit. Mason's gradual return to the world of the living. Neither was the same as before their trauma, but perhaps they were better, more compassionate, more resilient, more appreciative of each day's small victories. As Mason led Phoenix back to her stall for the night, he realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not just enduring it, but actually anticipating it. There would be Tyler's visit to prepare, for Phoenix's exercises to oversee, and now, remarkably, other connections to maintain. We've come a long way, he told Phoenix as he filled her water bucket for the night. Both of us. The mare's intelligent eyes seemed to hold his gaze, acknowledging the journey they had traveled together and the distance yet to go. She's ready for the next phase of rehabilitation, Dr. Winters announced, reviewing his notes after Phoenix's 6-month checkup. The renowned veterinarian had made a point of personally monitoring her progress, making the 3-hour drive from Omaha every month since the surgery. Mason leaned against the paddock fence, watching as Tyler led Phoenix in a careful circle, her movements growing more confident with each passing week. What does that involve exactly? Controlled exercise under saddle, Dr. Winters replied, his experienced eyes assessing Phoenix's gait. Very light at first, just getting her accustomed to carrying weight again, then gradually building up to short rides at a walk, eventually a gentle trot. Nothing strenuous, but enough to strengthen those surgical repairs and rebuild muscle memory. Mason frowned slightly. You're talking about riding her after everything she's been through? Dr. Winters nodded, understanding Mason's concern. I know it seems counterintuitive, but horses like Phoenix, athletic, well-bred animals, they're happiest when they have a purpose. Proper riding with the right person can actually be therapeutic for her. I don't know, Mason said, crossing his arms. She's come so far, I don't want to risk setting her back. That's exactly why you need Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Winters said, smiling slightly. Best equine rehabilitation specialist in the Midwest. Works with traumatized horses, gets results nobody else can. She's a miracle worker. Another expert? Mason raised an eyebrow. Phoenix's care had already involved more professionals than he could have imagined when he'd first found her. Veterinarians, surgeons, farriers, even an equine dental specialist when they'd discovered issues with her teeth from years of neglect. "The last one, I promise," Dr. Winters said, "but she's essential if you want Phoenix to reach her full potential. Rebecca understands that horses carry emotional trauma in their bodies, just like people do. Her approach addresses both the physical and psychological aspects of recovery." Mason watched as Phoenix nudged Tyler affectionately, seeking the apple slice she knew he had hidden in his pocket. The mare had come so far from the broken creature he'd found in the storm, her body healing, her spirit brightening with each passing day. But there were still moments when a sudden movement or unfamiliar object would trigger her fear response, moments when the shadow of her past abuse darkened her eyes. "All right," he conceded. "How do we reach her?" 3 days later, a dusty blue pickup truck with a small horse trailer pulled into Mason's driveway. The woman who stepped out wasn't what Mason had expected. Dr. Winters had described a miracle worker, conjuring images of someone older, perhaps intimidating. Rebecca Martinez was neither. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with dark hair, pulled back in a practical braid, and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She wore worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a faded denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned, muscular forearms. "You must be Mason Cooper," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her voice carrying a slight accent that Mason couldn't quite place. "Dr. Winters has told me all about you and your miracle horse." "Phoenix," Mason corrected automatically. "She's the miracle, not me." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "In my experience, healing like hers doesn't happen without someone who cares deeply. May I meet her?" As they walked toward the paddock, Mason found himself explaining Phoenix's routine, her preferences, her progress, details he hadn't realized he'd catalogued so thoroughly until they came pouring out. "She doesn't like being approached from her blind side. That right eye still has limited vision, and she spooks at loud metallic sounds, so we're careful with buckets and tools around her. She loves apples, but won't touch pears, which is strange. Because most horses—" Mason trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about his rambling. Rebecca was watching him with an amused expression. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied, her smile widening. "It's just nice to meet someone who pays such close attention. Most people don't observe their horses that carefully." They reached the paddock where Phoenix was grazing peacefully. At their approach, she lifted her head, ears pricking forward with interest. "There she is," Mason said unnecessarily, feeling oddly nervous about this introduction. Rebecca didn't immediately enter the paddock or call to Phoenix. Instead, she stood quietly at the fence, observing. "May I have a moment with her alone?" she asked. Mason hesitated, then nodded, stepping back several paces. He watched as Rebecca simply waited, making no attempt to approach the horse or attract her attention. After a few minutes, Phoenix's curiosity got the better of her. The mare walked slowly toward the stranger, head extended, nostrils flaring. To catch her scent, Rebecca remained perfectly still as Phoenix investigated her, sniffing her hands, her clothes, her hair. Only when the mare had completed her inspection did Rebecca slowly raise a hand to stroke her neck. "Hello, beautiful girl," she murmured, her voice barely audible to Mason. "You've been through quite a journey, haven't you?" What happened next took Mason by surprise. Phoenix, who had taken weeks to trust him enough for physical contact, leaned her head against Rebecca's shoulder, exhaling deeply as if in relief. The connection between them was immediate and profound. "She recognizes a kindred spirit," Rebecca explained later as they sat on Mason's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Horses are incredibly intuitive. They can sense when someone understands their language." "And you do?" Mason asked, not skeptically but with genuine curiosity. Rebecca smiled, tracing a finger along a scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. I was thrown from a horse when I was 9 years old. Shattered my arm in 3 places. Everyone expected me to be terrified of horses after that, but instead I became obsessed with understanding them. She paused, taking a sip from the mug of coffee Mason had offered. By the time I was 12, I was working with the most difficult cases at my uncle's stable in New Mexico. The biters, the bolters, the ones everyone else had given up on. Like Phoenix, Mason said. Like Phoenix, she agreed, but she's actually not as damaged as many I've worked with. Yes, she's experienced terrible physical abuse, but somewhere in her history, before the bad times, someone loved her. She remembers. Of that, it's giving her something to return to. Over the next several days, Mason observed as Rebecca began Phoenix's new rehabilitation program. Unlike the medical professionals who had treated the mare's physical injuries, Rebecca's approach seemed almost mystical at times. She spent hours simply being with Phoenix, sometimes grooming her, sometimes just sitting nearby reading a book while the mare grazed. "Aren't you supposed to be training her?" Mason asked on the 3rd day, his practical nature questioning this apparent inactivity. Rebecca looked up from where she sat cross-legged in the paddock, Phoenix dozing, standing nearby. "I am training her. I'm teaching her that humans can be present without demanding anything, that safety doesn't have to be earned through performance. It's the foundation everything else will build on." Mason wasn't entirely convinced, but he had to admit that Phoenix seemed to be flourishing under Rebecca's care. The mare's eyes were softer, her movements more relaxed. Even her coat seemed to shine with new vitality. On the 5th day, Rebecca brought a small training saddle from her trailer. "Today we begin the physical work," she explained to Mason, "but only if she's ready." The process of introducing the saddle was unlike anything Mason had witnessed before. Rebecca spent nearly an hour just allowing Phoenix to inspect the equipment, sniffing and even mouthing the stirrups and girth. When she finally placed the saddle pad on the mare's back, it was with such gentle, deliberate movements that Phoenix barely flicked an ear in response. "The key is making it her choice," Rebecca explained, as she carefully positioned the lightweight saddle. "Horses who have been abused associate tack with pain and force. We need to rewrite that association." By the end of the session, Phoenix was wearing the saddle comfortably, walking around the paddock without signs of distress. Rebecca hadn't attempted to mount her or add the pressure of a rider's weight. That would come later, she explained, when Phoenix was psychologically ready. "How long will this take?" Mason asked as they removed the saddle at the end of the day. "As long as it takes," Rebecca replied simply. "With horses like Phoenix, pushing too fast undermines everything. We follow her timeline, not ours." Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca's patient approach began to yield remarkable results. Phoenix progressed from accepting the saddle to tolerating weight, first just Rebecca leaning gently across her back, then sitting momentarily, then for longer periods. Throughout it all, Rebecca maintained a constant dialogue with the mare, reading her body language and adjusting accordingly. Tyler, who had initially been skeptical of this strange woman with her unconventional methods, became Rebecca's most enthusiastic student, absorbing her every word and mimicking her gentle handling techniques. "Do you think I could learn to do what you do?" the boy asked one afternoon, helping Rebecca groom Phoenix after a particularly successful session. "You already are," she replied, smiling at his surprised expression. "The most important part isn't technique, it's listening with your whole self. And you're very good at that, Tyler." Mason, watching from the fence, felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in Phoenix's progress and Tyler's dedication, gratitude for Rebecca's expertise, and something else, a warming of his long, cold heart. as he observed the natural rapport between the rehabilitation specialist and the boy who had become like family to him. "She likes you," Mason said to Rebecca later that evening as they reviewed Phoenix's training plan for the coming week. "Phoenix? Yes, we've developed a good connection," Rebecca replied, misunderstanding his meaning. "I meant Tyler," Mason clarified. "He's not usually so open with strangers. Takes after me that way, I guess." Rebecca smiled, looking out toward the paddock where Phoenix grazed in the evening light. "Tyler reminds me of myself at that age, so eager to understand, to help. He has a gift with animals. He wants to be a veterinarian," Mason said. "At least that's what he told me last week. Week before that it was an astronaut." Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet farm. "He could be both. Astronaut veterinarian, specializing in space horses." The joke caught Mason off guard, and he found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in longer than he could remember. The sensation felt foreign, but welcome, like discovering a muscle long unused, but still functional. As the days stretched into a second month of Rebecca's guidance, Phoenix's transformation accelerated. The mare who had once stood at death's door now carried Rebecca at a walk around the small paddock, her gait growing smoother and more confident with each session. The surgical leg, while not perfect, supported her weight with increasing strength. "She's ready for more space," Rebecca announced. "One morning, this paddock has served its purpose, but she needs to stretch those legs properly now." "Do you have a larger enclosure?" Mason nodded. "The main pasture, about 5 acres with good fencing. I haven't used it since—" He trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. "Since Sarah's horse," Rebecca completed quietly. Dr. Winters had filled her in on Mason's background, explaining the parallel healing journeys of man and horse. Mason cleared his throat. "I'll need to check the fencing, make sure it's still secure." "I can help with that," Rebecca offered. "2 sets of eyes are better than one." They spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of the pasture, testing fence posts and mending the occasional weak spot. The physical labor was oddly satisfying, and Mason found himself enjoying Rebecca's company, her practical knowledge, her quiet humor, her evident passion for her work. "Why do you do this?" he asked, as they hammered a new support beam into place. "Rehabilitation work, I mean. Must be easier ways to make a living with your skills." Rebecca paused, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm. "My first year out of college, I worked at a high-end show barn. Beautiful facilities, expensive horses, wealthy clients, made good money." She drove another nail with precise force. "One day, a client brought in a new horse. Champion jumper, cost more than most people's houses. But something had happened, and the horse wouldn't jump anymore, just froze at every obstacle." She stopped working, her eyes distant with memory. "The trainer tried force, spurs, whip, the works. I objected, got fired on the spot, but I couldn't stop thinking about that horse and what had happened to break its spirit. So I studied, apprenticed with anyone who would teach me, developed my own approach to traumatized horses." Mason nodded, understanding. "And Phoenix is just another case to you." Rebecca met his gaze directly. "No horse is just another case, Mason. Each one teaches me something new. Each one matters." She smiled, slightly. "And Phoenix is special even by those standards. So is her person. So is her—" The following day, with the pasture deemed safe, it was time for Phoenix's expansion into new territory. Mason, Rebecca, and Tyler stood at the gate, watching as the mare cautiously explored her enlarged world. At first, Phoenix stayed close to the gate, reluctant to venture far from the familiar, but gradually her confidence grew. She took a few tentative steps, then a few more, until finally, in a moment that brought tears to Tyler's eyes, she broke into a controlled trot across the open field, her golden mane and tail flying in the breeze. "Look at her go," Tyler exclaimed, clapping his hands in excitement. Rebecca smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's what healing looks like, Tyler. Not just repairing what's broken, but remembering joy. Mason watched Phoenix's exuberant movement. Across the pasture, his throat tight with emotion. The mare paused at the far fence line, looked back toward them, then kicked up her heels in what could only be described as delight before continuing her exploration. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" he asked quietly. Rebecca nodded, her hand finding Mason's for a brief, comforting squeeze. "More than okay. She's going to thrive." In that moment, with Phoenix running free under the vast Nebraska sky, Mason allowed himself to believe that perhaps the same might be true for him. 1 year to the day after the storm that brought Phoenix into Mason's life, the Riverbrook County Fair was in full swing. Colorful tents dotted the fairgrounds, the air filled with the mingling scents of cotton candy, livestock, and fresh hay. Children darted between exhibits, while judges evaluated everything from quilts to cattle. In the equestrian area, a small crowd had gathered around the practice ring, where Phoenix stood calmly as Tyler adjusted her braided mane. The golden mare bore little resemblance to the broken creature Mason had pulled from the mud that stormy night. Her coat gleamed in the autumn sunlight, muscles rippling beneath her skin as she shifted her weight, impatient to begin. "Nervous?" Mason asked, handing Tyler the special blue and gold show halter the boy had made months earlier. Tyler nodded, his expression a mix of excitement and anxiety. "What if she gets scared with all these people watching?" "She won't," Rebecca said confidently, approaching from the registration booth. "You two have been practicing for months. She trusts you completely." The novice handler competition wasn't particularly prestigious. Just a simple event where young handlers demonstrated basic groundwork with their horses. But for Tyler and Phoenix, it represented something profound. A journey completed, a circle closed. When it was their turn to enter the ring, Tyler straightened his shoulders and led Phoenix forward with quiet confidence. The mare moved beside him willingly, her steps measured and calm despite the crowd and unfamiliar surroundings. Mason watched from the rail, his chest tight with emotion, as Tyler guided Phoenix through the pattern they'd practiced countless times in the pasture. The boy's commands were gentle but clear, his body language assured. Phoenix responded perfectly, pivoting, backing, and changing gaits on cue, as if they'd been partners for years rather than months. When the judge approached to ask Tyler questions about his horse, the boy's face lit up with pride. "This is Phoenix," he explained, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ring. "She's a rescue. Mr. Cooper found her during a storm last year when she was hurt real bad. Everyone said she wouldn't make it, but we didn't give up on her. The dear judge," a stern-faced woman with decades of equestrian experience, softened visibly. "She's in beautiful condition now. You must have worked very hard." Tyler nodded solemnly. "She taught me that healing takes time and patience, and that sometimes the most broken ones turn out to be the strongest." As they exited the ring to warm applause, Mason felt a hand slip into his. Rebecca stood beside him, her eyes suspiciously bright. "That kid," she said, shaking her head in wonder. "He just gets it." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Watching Tyler and Phoenix together, both transformed by their unlikely bond, hit him with a wave of emotion he couldn't quite contain. The awards ceremony later that afternoon brought another surprise. Tyler and Phoenix didn't just place in their division, they won it, with the judge citing their exceptional partnership and the evident bond between boy and horse. As Tyler accepted the blue ribbon, beaming with pride, Mason found himself surrounded by townspeople offering congratulations. Eleanor from the diner dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Bill Gunderson clapped him on the back so hard he nearly stumbled. Sheriff Mike Davidson stood nearby, nodding with quiet satisfaction. Never thought I'd see the day, Mike said, watching as Tyler carefully attached the ribbon to Phoenix's halter. That horse competing in a show, you back among the living. Miracles do happen. Mason smiled, his gaze drifting to where Rebecca stood chatting with Tyler's parents. Over the past months, she had transitioned from consultant to friend, her visits continuing long after Phoenix's formal rehabilitation had ended. The warmth he felt watching her laugh had become familiar, no longer surprising, but welcome nonetheless. Speaking of miracles, Mike continued, following Mason's gaze with knowing eyes, when are you going to ask that woman out properly? The whole town's been taking bets. Mason shook his head, chuckling despite himself. Is that right? Eleanor's got $20 on Christmas. I say you won't wait that long. Before Mason could respond, Tyler came running over, the blue ribbon. He clutched in his hand, Phoenix following dutifully behind. We did it, Mr. Cooper, the boy exclaimed. The judge said Phoenix has the best temperament she's seen in years, especially for a rescue. Mason knelt to the boy's level, looking him straight in the eye. That's because she has the best handler, Tyler. You did the work. You believed in her when it mattered. Tyler's expression turned serious. We all did. That's why she got better. That evening, as the fair wound down and the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mason found himself standing beside Phoenix's stall in the temporary barn. The mare was contentedly munching hay, seemingly unfazed by her competitive. Success or the day's excitement? Big day, huh? He said quietly, stroking her neck. Phoenix paused her eating to press her muzzle against his chest, the affectionate gesture that had become her trademark. She's come full circle, Rebecca observed, joining him at the stall door. From fighting for her life to winning blue ribbons. Pretty remarkable journey, Mason nodded, looking into Phoenix's intelligent eyes. Tyler's right about one thing. We all needed each other. Phoenix, Tyler, you, me, the whole town. Somehow we all ended up being part of the same story. Rebecca smiled, leaning slightly against his shoulder. That's how healing works best, connected, not isolated. As they stood together in comfortable silence, Mason realized that the broken pieces of his life had reassembled themselves into something new, different from what had been before, but whole in its own way. Phoenix had been the catalyst, but the transformation had rippled outward, touching everyone around them. Ready to head home? Rebecca asked as Phoenix finished her hay. Mason looked at her, really looked, and saw his future opening before him with possibilities he'd thought forever lost. Yes, he said simply, I think I am. As they led Phoenix to the trailer under a canopy of emerging stars, Mason knew with certainty that some storms, despite their fury, don't just destroy. Sometimes, against all odds, they deliver exactly what's needed to rebuild.